Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are joining us today for this virtual conversation on U.S.-German cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. The war in Ukraine has obviously brought transatlantic relations much closer. Has had a transformative effect on Europe, but there's a lot of questions of how this will affect the Indo-Pacific and how it will affect, in particular, Germany's policy toward the Indo-Pacific. And joining me for this conversation today is Ambassador Petra Sigmund, who is Director General for Asia and the Pacific at the German Foreign Office. And within the Foreign Office, she has held the post of Deputy Director General for East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. She's the head of the East Asia Division, or she's been the head of the East Asia Division, which has covered China, Japan, and the Republic of Korea. And I'm so delighted that she can join us here today at CSIS virtually for this event. I'm Max Bergman. I'm the director of the Europe program. And to have a conversation between someone who focuses on Europe from an American perspective and someone from Europe who's focused on Asia. Ambassador Sigmund, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. Good morning.
Good morning. And let me just say, for those joining us virtually, you can also submit a question on the online webpage. We'll go through the questions toward the end of the conversation and select some of the best ones. So please feel free to submit a question through the Ask Live Questions button. But let me get started. Petra, the events in Ukraine have obviously had a transformative impact on Germany. We all have heard the Zeitenwende when Chancellor Olaf Scholz announced massive increases in defense spending just days after the war. I'm curious how this is impacting your job, how this is impacting how Germany sees China, sees the Indo-Pacific.
In two ways. One way is looking at the China-Russia declaration of the 4th of February, in which we realized that the two of them are acting together in two directions of the Eurasian continent, if you wish. They're up against, together, NATO enlargement in the European Union, and they together are kind of holding up or trying to position themselves against what they would call US-led military alliances in the Indo-Pacific. So there is a common thrust, distance NATO in Europe and distance what they view as some form of NATO enlargement in the Indo-Pacific. But then also in the statement, they clearly say they support each other's core interests. So we know, Russia's core interest, if you wish, is Ukraine. China's core interest, or one of them, is Taiwan. There are others. So we see them acting together, possibly in the future in that theater. We see a concept of so-called common adjacent regions, where they kind of envisage a world where in the Russian adjacent region in Europe, countries would do as Russia would wish. And this is possibly also the concept in the Indo-Pacific, a hegemonic concept, which is not our concept of how we think sovereign states should interact. We see them both, especially that talking about territorial integrity only in a combination with so-called legitimate security interests. So that to us means the whole concept of territorial integrity being one of the paramount, timeless, if you wish, concepts of the UN Charter is put into question and is balanced with so-called legitimate security interests. So we see the two of them acting together to the detriment of the rules-based international order in Europe, and we see that there is one order. It's one rules-based international order. And we see that this order is now very concretely under pressure in Europe, Ukraine, but it's long been under pressure in the Indo-Pacific also. We have been working together really well in this Ukraine-Russia crisis. Asia has helped us. Many Asian countries have supported a strong position in the United Nations General Assembly, are helping with sanctions, are helping with humanitarian aid. Now we feel we also need to be present in the Indo-Pacific to help defend the rules-based international order there.
Great, thank you. One of the concerns, I think, going forward when it comes to sanctions that are being put in place vis-a-vis Russia is that Russia will be able to get around these sanctions through Chinese help or China looking the other way. How concerned are you about the Russia-Chinese relationship in terms of enabling Russia to work around sanctions to be able to get the technology that they need to kind of maintain their defense industry and other parts of their economy?
We've had a number of conversations with the Chinese government about that, not the least at the EU-China summit, which was mostly dedicated to that issue. And we signaled very clearly that China circumventing the sanctions or enabling Russia to continue its war against Ukraine, directly enabling, that would have severe consequences on the European relationship with China. And at the moment, we keep a close eye on what is happening because, we don't want anyone to give China the means to continue this war any longer. We watch very closely. We see more or less, China following the sanctions and abiding by them, but we're also aware the tighter the sanctions will become, the better they will work. We'll have to watch, again, more closely to how could this be circumvented. So as much as we see compliance is there at the moment, for the future, need to keep a very close eye on, possible trying to purchase technology through companies of other countries and then deliver them covertly to Russia. Now realizing that could be a way to circumvent sanctions means we have to watch more closely to what do we export to whom, and that is underway.
I want to ask you a bit about the Zeitenwende, the increase in defense spending. Germany last fall sent a frigate through the South China Sea to do a freedom of navigation operation. And one question is, what role will the increased defense spending, a more capable, competent, powerful German military mean for the Indo-Pacific? How do you see the investments that are playing out, that are being planned? How will that impact Germany's military posture in the Indo-Pacific?
We're not a military actor in the Indo-Pacific. I think that would be overstretching it and over-interpreting it. But we meant to demonstrate that upholding the rules-based national order, peaceful resolution of conflict, international law in the Indo-Pacific is a national interest to Germany. We have many good partners in the Indo-Pacific. The whole area is important for us economically. Most of our supply chains end there or start there. We have every interest in a stable, free, and open Indo-Pacific, and we demonstrated this, I shall say, national interest in this preservation of the rules-based order by sending a national ship. That's what it was doing. But then we pushed hard or argued and convinced others that we needed a European Indo-Pacific strategy, and that has been published now. And it includes a more regular European maritime presence in the Indo-Pacific because, again, we see rules-based order in the area is under pressure. And we don't want to give the impression this is all between the region and China, the US and China. This is about preserving this one order that we have, and we should all be interested in preserving it. And so you will see us Europeans coming more often to the Indo-Pacific region to underline our interest, our very strong interest in preserving the rules and the order and the peace in the region.
I want to ask a bit about Taiwan. The president made some news recently over saying that the U.S. would have a military commitment to come to Taiwan's aid, and then stating today that the policy has not changed. So I think we can safely say the policy of strategic ambiguity remains in place. But I'm curious how Germany sees Taiwan. How do you think China has interpreted events in Ukraine? Has that impacted at all their calculus? And curious your reaction to what's happened over the last few days with the president.
Well, we do. I mean, we've heard Xi Jinping, say that the problem of unification with China cannot be handed down future generations. So he gives the impression that, this is kind of within his lifetime. He wants to do something about it. We have been stressing that unification with Taiwan must be peaceful, must be, agreed on both sides of the Taiwan Strait. Otherwise, uphold the status quo is a good policy to preserve. In the framework, of course, we have a one China policy. We only have diplomatic relations with Beijing, but we do have relations with Taiwan, and we speak up on behalf of Taiwan, especially when it comes to its inclusion into the work of international organizations. We've just done so at the WHO World Health Assembly, speaking up, directly with many others for Taiwan's participation as an observer in the work of this health organization. So we feel we don't need to be shy about our relationship with Taiwan, which is a good relationship, but still in the framework of a one China policy, and in the framework of, the whole status can only be changed, in a non-coercive, in a peaceful way that is agreed on both sides of the strait. So as long as, one side of the strait is giving the impression that that could be different, we need to speak up in order to preserve peace over the Taiwan Strait. And so we have, with partners in the G7 framework, but also in other fora, we keep an eye on the situation in the Taiwan Strait. We are somewhat concerned about, military posturing, about also, what has been said about, plans to unify and the threat with use of force. That's a point of concern, and we, for the time being, make clear that this is of concern also to us, and we make clear what policies we want to prevail.
The issue of Taiwan has often come up in EU-China relations, China taking retaliatory measures against Lithuania. I mean, this is clearly going to be an issue going forward. How do you sort of maintain European unity, EU unity, speaking with one voice when it comes to China on this issue? Is that a challenge? Have the Chinese been successful in dividing in Europe with its Wolf Warrior diplomacy, or has that backfired?
I mean, we've always said in Europe we follow a one China policy. We've only got diplomatic relations with Beijing. That is the case for every European member states, but it is our one China policy, and we retain the power to interpret how do we exactly conduct our relationship with Taiwan. China has been urging for the past years for a so-called one China principle, as if there were only one way to conduct the relationship with Taiwan. That's not our view. And now Lithuania has opened a Taipei representative office, Taiwan representative office under a certain name. Then came economic pressure from China to make Lithuania back down. What China did not realize at first is that the European Union is so integrated, economically so integrated. If you hit one, you target one, you're hitting all of us. And that is why it was good that the European Union has said, we're not leaving Lithuania alone here. This is directed against all of us. If it's directed against one of us, it's directed against all of us. So it's now the European Union dealing with China, trying to handle this, get them to lift their measures. It's been very unreasonable, the reaction that they had. That is underway. We've all been solidary in the European Union that type of, the way in which a problem is being addressed through, economic pressure, coercive measures, it's just not the way we think problems or differences in opinion should be addressed. So on the one hand, we're handling this, European Union with China, try to mitigate the effects. On the other hand, we're in the process of doting ourselves with an anti-coercion instrument in the European Union. So if this occurs again by whomever actor, so that we have a procedure that can end up by measures actually to close off the market or the access to investment, government procurement, give higher tariffs, things that will then have an impact on the economic relationship of the country that is threatening us with coercive measures. So that is progressing quite well under the impression that work, but that's kind of the way we are reacting. Has the policy China has adopted vis-a-vis Lithuania been successful? I dare say no. I really dare say no, and it would be much better to be more reasonable in policy, be more, dialogue oriented, and this whole thing about this one China principle that everyone needs to follow is just not our view as sovereign countries of how we, conduct our foreign relations.
I want to stick with trade for a moment. Roughly in 2020, the EU completed the trade and investment agreement with China. That is now sort of frozen by the European Parliament after China sanctioned a number of European parliamentarians and other think tank officials. I'm curious how you see trade with China going forward. This is obviously a conversation that we're having in the United States after the trade and investment agreement was agreed to. Incoming National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan famously tweeted, "I hope to have a conversation with the Europeans about this." So, is there a conversation happening? What's the sort of level of dialogue with the United States when it comes to trade with China, and how do you see trade with China evolving?
Okay, we have a very good conversation with the United States. We're in a partnership also on our relationship with China and how we conduct our China policies, and that is a very good way of cooperating, learning from each other, exchanging, previewing what is going to happen. So that's really a very good partnership that we have with Washington on China issues. Now, there was probably a misunderstanding about the investment agreement. This wasn't meant to increase European investment in China dramatically. It was meant to give to level the playing field of conditions of investment, because we had long felt, Chinese investments in Europe. Is very easy to do those, not many thresholds that you have to climb over, and it was very difficult for us to invest into interesting sectors in China, and so we try to level the playing field. Probably 50% of the interest in this investment agreement was because we pushed for it under German EU presidency, was to demonstrate that in the partnership with China is actually possible to make qualitative progress. So we haven't had that for a while, and we had negotiated for 7 years and thought, it's high time now to conclude this and then demonstrate really things can go forward. Now that kind of dropped dead because of other reasons, and the political signal, has been, in the way of, we were at the same time of doing the KAI, we have under German EU presidency adopted a human rights sanctions instrument in the European Union, which we didn't have before. And then, one of the first countries that we adopted sanctions against was China because of Xinjiang. Today, dramatic new revelations of a Xinjiang policy by China. have demonstrated that we've done the right thing with those sanctions. So, and in the course of counter-sanctions, the political signal of this investment agreement couldn't be maintained. Now we need to look at, whether this is actually still interesting. At the moment, the China, we maintain our sanctions because of Xinjiang policies, and we review them regularly. China has so far maintained its sanctions against a huge number of people that are in the middle of the EU-China relationship. Very much to the contrary, our sanctions were directed towards people who are directly implicated in the policies in Xinjiang. China's counter-sanctions targeted people that are in the middle, in the center of EU-China relations. So it's really been detrimental for for being able to conduct those relations. So we need to see whether on the side of the Chinese counter-sanctions they can probably alleviate them. And then, only then is the moment to reconsider, will we do this investment agreement? Is it still interesting? Because really, as I said, we started negotiating 7 years ago, and that was a different China, and we had different issues. The issues are new ones, so there is a little bit of a feeling it addresses the problems of the past, but not the actual ones. So, in that ambiguity shall be my answer.
Okay. Well, I want to turn to US-EU cooperation. The Trade and Tech Council, the USEU Trade and Tech Council just met in Paris. A lot of descriptions of the motivation, at least on the American side, is that this is essentially about improving collaboration with the US and Europe, but it's largely about, a lot of it is about China and trying to synchronize so that we sort of set the rules of the road when it comes to trade and technology standards. How do you, as someone who's focused on Asia, what's your role in the US-EU Trade and Tech Council? What do you see coming out of it? And what are the sort of implications for the Indo-Pacific?
I mean, the dialogue is between the European institutions and Washington and all the relevant bodies. But the people sitting around the table is the European institutions on the European side, but still, it's the member states very often that adopt then the policies, especially export controls, export restrictions. So it trickles down. We feed in. It's the way we do it in Europe. We're accustomed to doing that, and we make sure in the Foreign Office that we try and coordinate China policies in the German government, that we really highlight what tech export, what are the risks that we need to be aware of, and that we need to adapt our policies to. I mean, we have a civil-military fusion in China. We need to be sure that when we export tech, that things don't go into military developments that might be, might be turned against us or against partners. So that's one. We must be sure that when we export technology, that it doesn't feed into the whole repressive apparatus, in Xinjiang, in Tibet, into any sort of human rights violations. We also want to be sure that we're not contributing to, them being further and further ahead of us technology-wise, so that we, keep our competitive edge. We're struggling hard because Europe, when it comes to future technologies, AI, quantum computing, isn't doing terribly well. So we must be smart about this also. So for all those reasons, we need a responsible export policy. And in order to be responsible, you need to constantly review and think about what is in our interest, what can we export, because we do entertain a successful trade relationship with China. I'll probably come to that. But it has to be conducted in a responsible way so that it doesn't threaten our values or our interests or those of our partners. Because clearly what we don't want is, partners say no and we say yes. That's really detrimental. If we say we act, in a cooperative way on the basis of shared interests and values, then we also need to compare policies, make sure that we act in a parallel way.
Great. I have a couple more questions, and then we'll go to some from the audience. You work for a German green foreign minister. Climate change is clearly a major priority for the German government. And this is a topic of immense importance in our relations with China. I'm curious how you see cooperation when it comes to climate issues with the Chinese. Note at COP, there was the US-EU Green Steel deal, which still has to sort of be finalized and negotiated. But the implications of that would be massive tariffs potentially against Chinese steel that is much more carbon intensive, and how you sort of see climate relations going forth, especially if CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, comes into place. So curious, what's the sort of state of German-China climate relations, EU-China climate relations?
We've this new German government. We've installed a climate envoy, and we've installed this person, Jennifer Morgan, the former head of Greenpeace, American-German national, if you wish. She's now our national climate envoy, and she works in the Foreign Office, and she is very, very active, also speaking with her Chinese counterparts, the Chinese Environment Minister, the Planning Commission, in order to, get this cooperation, this regular dialogue. Where is policy headed? What can we do to support each other to get that started? One important principle for us is that on global issues, like reducing climate change or preventing climate change, or poverty alleviation, or preserving peace in the world, on global issues, cooperation shall not be weaponized. We can't have preconditions on cooperation on global issues, and we have to be really clear about this, that we will not bow to preconditions, but it should be a principle between all responsible nations that when it comes to global issues, tackling those, then no weaponization, no precondition, but cooperation in good faith. And in that spirit, we are engaging China on their climate policies, on carbon emissions reduction. And yes, in the background is the European plan to install a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is, we don't know when exactly it will come, but we stand behind it. We think it's a good mechanism to factor in the externalized costs of climate change, to make them be borne by those who don't do enough to prevent climate change from happening. So that's a very good backdrop. Against this backdrop, we're speaking up in favor of a climate club of ambitious countries that learn from each other, that act together in order to do what they can with each other's support to be not incremental any longer, but take some real decisions to reduce carbon emissions and to save our climate. Because all the reports you read, all the temperatures you learn about, it demonstrates climate change is there, and it's going to affect us all on each and every continent. So it really warrants a good cooperation also with China. And with India, I shall say, the two of them are to a large extent going to decide about whether the climate will be tenable on this planet or not.
Well, one just quick follow-up. So Australia just had an election. Climate was a major topic. There's a new prime minister. What do you see the prospects for EU-Australia, German-Australia cooperation, not just on climate, but in general going forward?
Good ones. I mean, we have, we're very happy about this change, this possible change in climate policy. They're very active on hydrogen, green hydrogen production, green hydrogen exports. We want to support them in that, but also, if they can cut down on coal exports, that would of course be something that we would really like to see that they do a conversion here in their policy. So we'll be working with them very closely. We also we're in negotiations about an FTA with Australia, because we see we want to diversify our trade relations in Asia. When I say we, it's Germany, but it's also the whole of the European Union. We've been, very focused on China, and it was right to do so because it had very good, growth rates. But putting all the eggs in one basket is not a very sustainable policy. So we want to diversify, go into trade agreements, but also by diversifying, give the opportunity to our partners to diversify their trade relations. Because you look at, some countries in the Indo-Pacific, they're very much focused on the Chinese market, and any sort of, if this turns into dependency, and that every country has to, see to that on its own, but dependency will limit your sovereignty. So diversification policy is a big word in Germany and in Europe.
The last question before we go to the audience. So there's been a flurry of Indo-Pacific strategies from the US, Europe. Where do you see the convergences? Where maybe are there some slight divergences between the strategies? And what's your sort of overall take on reading these different various strategies?
Well, the overall is, how important an area the Indo-Pacific is, because it's got, there are countries in the Indo-Pacific with whom we clearly want to cooperate much more, because upholding this rules-based international order, you need partners. You need majorities at UNGA. You really need to have a team that shares the values, or the values and the interests. And we see that there are a lot of possible partners in the Indo-Pacific, some obvious ones, the G7 partnership, of course, but then others coming forward, adjusting their policies, realizing, we need partners, we want a certain type of interaction in the Indo-Pacific, and we want to be with partners. So that partners, but then also the interest in the economic developments in the Indo-Pacific. I described ours. I think there is an interest in Asia also in diversification, conquering new markets for themselves in Europe, maybe also the US. So I see a convergence there. Plus, I shall say I see a convergence with regard to the concern about peace, stability in the region itself. We see this is a region full of challenges, with a lot of military built up at the moment, where it's really good to demonstrate that we will not leave the weaker, smaller countries in the region to themselves, but we will, as this region is of interest to us, we will be there, and we will be there to defend the principles of the rules-based order in the region. I think there we do all agree. We would in Europe, and I think ASEAN Indo-Pacific Outlook is doing the same. We still believe in, or we say our Indo-Pacific policies are inclusive. We invite China to participate in our policies, but according to our, principles, values of rules-based order. Often they won't join because they don't think they can cooperate with us. But to us, it's important to, leave the door open to demonstrate, if you decide you want to cooperate on the basis of those rules, we're here. Just walk through the door, we're here. So that's kind of a gesture that is built into the European Indo-Pacific policies.
Great. So we'll go to a question from the audience. The first one is from Noah Barkin at GMF, who I believe is based in Berlin. He asked, German Foreign Minister Baerbock spoke today with Wang Yi, her Chinese counterpart, about the shocking new revelations about human rights abuses in Xinjiang. And UN Human Rights Commissioner Michelle Bachelet is currently in China to take a look at Xinjiang for herself, but she clearly won't have unfettered access or be free to move around freely. What are your expectations expectations for this visit, and what are the risks around it?
Well, we've called for a visit of the UN Human Rights Commissioner. We've called for that visit. You know, in every Human Rights Commission statement the European made on Xinjiang. But of course, it has to be. You know, we need to be certain that you know, when the Human Rights Commissioner travels, that she will have, you know, real access to wherever she wants to have access to. It cannot be a visit where everything is pre-staged, if you wish, and is pretended you're seeing Xinjiang when you're not really seeing what's going on in Xinjiang. So it's very important to, you know, but we think that that's also clear in the UN circle. It's important to be aware of what you're seeing and what you might not be seeing. And there, today's revelations, I mean, the content isn't entirely new. We've known about these policies for years. We've based sanctions on them. We've had so many sessions in the United Nations, even Security Council, Human Rights Council, to highlight and to ask China to stop its policies, end its policies, and to, you know, justify itself in front of the international community. So the content is not new, but the way it's documented is hard to deny what's going on. So of course today's revelations will put the visit of Madame Bachelet into a new perspective.
Great. Another question from the audience. Is there scope to work with the U.S. In the region, for example, with ASEAN or with more broadly in the Pacific, to build regional resilience?
Of course. Absolutely, because we share that aim to build regional resilience when it comes to, I mean, and there's many ways of building regional resilience. If it's, you know, Coast Guard activities, to be certain about, you know, that your territory is well predicted. There has now been, I've read with interest that in the Quad meeting, a new initiative about illegal fishing. That's important too, to be able to, you know, to verify, you know, the fishing activities. So everything that is capacity building and resilience, and there's many ways of resilience. There's also resilience against influence operations. We share the goal. We have capacities too, and there is room for many actors to, you know, with that same aim, strengthen the region's resilience to cooperate. And our cooperation with the U.S. and with other partners in the region, for the region, is very good on these issues.
And the final question is, what is your view of IPEF? So IPEF is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. This is Biden's new economic plan for the region. And whether Germany, the EU, or other like-minded states might support the U.S. objectives here. So what is your view of the current kind of economic plan that was put out by the United States? And I might add also, just from a perspective of the TPP or CPTPP, whether, you know, the EU has any perspective of trying to enter into that trade partnership.
I mean, Europe has its own trade policy with the region. We entered into FTAs with Korea, Japan, Singapore, Vietnam. We're negotiating with Australia, New Zealand, India, Indonesia. We will, you know, restart negotiations with Thailand and with the Philippines. So we have our policies there. They tend to have very high standards. That's why it takes a long time until we get to these agreements. But looking at the data is, you know, many countries in the region are very much exposed to just one market. And that's probably, it shows that they don't seem to have the opportunities to sell elsewhere. And as I said, as much as we're looking at diversification, we think the countries in the region should also have the chance, the opportunity to diversify, and that means big markets, as is the European market, have to think about opening this market for exporters from Asia Pacific. Now, up to I've understood that that element is not yet there in the Indo-Pacific economic framework, but there are a lot of principles that will allow more investment, better market access, better economic cooperation. So that's something that I had the feeling that was very well received in the region. It's an important element in also, in this region. There's so many initiatives of economic cooperation now that you really have to, if we want higher standards, then it takes leadership like the U.S. leadership to make sure that higher standards of, level playing field and of responsible, sustainable economics govern the region. And for that we share absolutely, and think we can act in parallel. Whether we will join initiatives is not in the cards at the moment, but I think the overall policy direction is very much similar.
Thank you so much. Maybe as just the closing comment, how do you see U.S., German, EU cooperation playing out over the next 5 years? And do you see real strong prospects for further collaboration and cooperation?
Absolutely. I think we're now in a spirit of partnership, where we value each other's contributions. We know we're not always doing the exact same things, but we're on the basis of the same values, the same worldview. We do what we can, and there is this spirit of working together. And that has really, that has reinvigorated G7, that has reinvigorated EU-US relations, but also our bilateral relations. So it's a very good spirit, and I think if we continue in that spirit, we can really, be of a tremendous support to each other, as is the U.S. now in Europe. I mean, it's a very good, a necessary and very good support, but we can do the same. We can also be supportive of U.S. concerns and policies in other parts of the world. But it needs, recognition of partnership and walking hand in hand, and that's what's happening. And there's, no limits to that if that continues.
Well, thank you, Director General Sigmund, for a really wide-ranging conversation covering the gamut of issues and challenges facing the Indo-Pacific and the nature of U.S.-German, U.S.-EU cooperation when it comes to the region. I think, just to close out, I think one of the major implications of this conflict in Ukraine is that the realization that really when the U.S. and Europe can work together, how strong we are. And I think that applies not only to standing up to Russia's invasion, but anywhere around the world. And so I think that sort of cooperation is something that I think this administration, I think future administrations will recognize is critical when facing the challenges of the Indo-Pacific. So with that, I'd like to thank you so much for taking time on this afternoon, this morning here in Washington. Thank you to all the viewers, listeners out there for tuning in, for asking questions. It's been a real pleasure to host you here at CSIS, and look forward to doing so in person at some point in the future. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Max. Thank you.
Thank you.